At 3:47 a.m. on December 16, 1944, Technical Sergeant Walter Kozlowski crouched in the lead tank of a 400-vehicle armoured column in the Ardennes forest, Belgium, watching fog reduce visibility to less than 30 feet. The column commander was Colonel James Hartwell, 38 years old, 14 months commanding armour, 0 successful night movements through contested terrain in low visibility. German forces had positioned defensive units across every road and trail through the forest. Hartwell's column needed to reach Bastogne before the Germans encircled it. They had 47 miles to cover in conditions where standard navigation was impossible. Kozlowski had been navigating for armoured columns for 11 months. He knew map reading inside and out, compass bearings, terrain association, dead reckoning, celestial navigation. Proven techniques for moving vehicles through unfamiliar territory. But armoured column navigation had one fatal problem that was getting American units lost every single week. Maps couldn't show what you couldn't see. Standard military maps showed terrain features, contour lines, roads, buildings, rivers, excellent for daytime navigation in clear conditions. But in fog, at night, in forests, those features became invisible. You couldn't navigate by terrain you couldn't identify. A column commander would be looking at his map, looking at the terrain, unable to match what he saw with what the map showed. American doctrine said armoured units should move during daylight, use clear weather, maintain visual reference to terrain features. Standard navigation procedures: move when you can see, stop when you can't. Hartwell had tried that doctrine 6 times. It hadn't worked. Weather didn't cooperate with battle plans. Fog came in. Darkness fell. The enemy attacked at inconvenient times. The Third Army had lost 34 armoured columns to navigation failures in the past 8 months. Most got separated, disoriented, ambushed, while trying to find their positions on maps that couldn't help them in the conditions they faced. Kozlowski had watched too many columns fail. Good units, professional soldiers. They moved out with confidence and came back scattered, depleted, defeated. Not by German firepower, by German weather and their own navigation systems. The training manual said the problem was navigator error. The instructors said these navigators weren't using their compasses properly, weren't calculating distances correctly, weren't following procedure. But Kozlowski knew better. The problem wasn't the navigators, it was the maps. Military maps were designed for land navigation. They showed what the terrain looked like from above. Hills, valleys, roads, buildings. Visual features that a navigator could identify and use for orientation. But when you couldn't see those features, the map became useless. You needed information the map didn't provide. Not what the terrain looked like, but what you would experience moving through it. Distance markers, turn counts, surface changes, elevation shifts. Measurable data that didn't require visibility, but standard maps didn't show that. They showed geographic features, not navigation sequences. Kozlowski had mentioned this to the operations officer at division headquarters 6 months ago. The officer said the maps were produced by the Army Map Service. Topographic standards were tested and approved. Changing them would require approval from the War Department. Besides, no field-level NCO had authorization to create navigation materials. That required cartographic training, and the Map Service was focused on producing maps for new operational areas. So Kozlowski did something that violated every regulation in the field manual on map reading and land navigation. He created his own map system, not based on terrain features, based on movement sequences, strip maps that showed the route as a series of instructions. Travel 0.8 miles, surface changes from paved to dirt, turn right. Travel 1.2 miles, cross small bridge, continue straight. The maps took 13 hours to create for the Bastogne route. They ignored terrain features entirely. They showed only the sequence of actions a driver needed to follow. They worked in complete darkness. Nobody authorized them. The staff officers who saw them called them kindergarten maps because they looked like children's drawings instead of proper military cartography. Kozlowski said nothing. He watched the column form up, felt the fog close in around the vehicles, felt the weight of 400 tanks, depending on navigation that everyone said wouldn't work. What happened in the next 11 hours would change how every armoured column in the European theatre moved through low visibility conditions. The first column Kozlowski lost to navigation failure was from the 2nd Armoured Division. October the 8th, 1944. 43 tanks moving to reinforce positions near Aachen. Kozlowski had been working with the division, helping plan routes. The maps were standard issue, excellent quality, clear terrain features. The column moved out at 0600. By 0900, they'd radioed that they were lost. Fog had reduced visibility to 50 feet. The navigator couldn't identify terrain features, couldn't determine position. The column stopped while the navigator tried to figure out where they were. At 10:15, German forces ambushed them. The column was stationary, disorganized, trying to navigate. Easy targets, 7 tanks destroyed, 11 more damaged, 32 casualties. The remaining tanks scattered. The after-action report blamed the navigator, said he'd failed to maintain proper orientation, failed to track movement, failed to follow procedure. But Kozlowski had trained that navigator. The guy was competent, knew his maps, knew his compass, did everything correctly. He just couldn't see the terrain features his map required him to identify. The navigator's name was Corporal David Chen. Chen survived the ambush, told Kozlowski afterward that he'd been checking his map constantly, comparing it to the terrain. But the fog made everything look the same. Trees, fields, roads. He couldn't tell where they were. The map showed what was there, but he couldn't see what was there. Chen navigated 2 more missions. Got lost both times. Lost his position. Had to use radio triangulation to relocate. The division transferred him to supply. Told him he wasn't suited for navigation. Chen spent the rest of the war driving supply trucks. Kozlowski heard he'd become withdrawn about it. Felt like he'd failed. Chen died in a truck accident in Germany in March 1945. Kozlowski went to the memorial service, stood in the back, remembered that Chen had been following the system. The system had failed him. But Chen got blamed anyway. The second column was from the 4th Armoured Division, November 3rd, 1944. Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding. Hayes was experienced, 21 months in combat. He knew armoured tactics inside and out. Knew the risks. Led carefully. Hayes's column was moving at night through the Vosges mountains. Clear weather, good visibility when they started. But fog rolled in at 0200 hours. Thick. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. Hayes slowed the column, tried to maintain navigation using dead reckoning, counted distance, tracked compass bearings, stayed on what he thought was the route. At 0347, the lead tank drove off a cliff. 12-foot drop into a ravine. Tank destroyed. Crew killed instantly. Hayes's map showed no cliffs in that area, showed flat terrain, gradual slopes. The map was wrong, or they were in the wrong location. Either way, 4 men were dead. Hayes stopped the column, called for artillery flares for illumination. Found they were 800 yards south of where he thought they were. In terrain that looked nothing like his map, dead reckoning had failed. Compass bearings had been correct, but accumulated errors had put them off course. Hayes got the column reoriented, but he'd lost 4 men to navigation failure, lost confidence, started second-guessing every decision. He completed the mission, but barely. Retired from the army in 1946, never talked about the war. Kozlowski heard he'd blamed himself for those deaths, felt he should have navigated better. By mid-December, Kozlowski had watched 18 columns fail their missions due to navigation problems. Some got lost and found their way eventually. Some got ambushed while disoriented. Some took wrong routes and missed objectives. But all of them had competent navigators using standard maps following correct procedures. And all of them failed because the procedures assumed visibility. The columns that survived came back with the same story. The maps didn't work in fog, in darkness, in forests. You'd know where you were supposed to be. Couldn't tell where you actually were. The map showed features you couldn't see. Without those features, the map was decorative paper. Most commanders thought that was just how armoured operations worked in bad conditions. Some navigation failures were expected, some losses were acceptable. You moved when conditions were good, hunkered down when they weren't. But Kozlowski knew that wasn't realistic. The enemy didn't wait for good weather. Battles happened in fog, in darkness, in conditions where standard navigation failed. He started paying attention to what navigators could measure in low visibility. Not terrain features. Those required sight. But movement. Distance travelled could be measured by odometer. Direction could be maintained by compass. Surface changes could be felt through the vehicle. Turns could be counted. Bridges could be heard and felt as the tank crossed them. None of that appeared on standard maps. But all of it could be used for navigation. Kozlowski mentioned this to Chen before the second armoured mission. Chen asked if there was a better way. Kozlowski said, "Nothing official, but unofficially there was a solution. It just required breaking regulations that could get them both court-martialed. The problem wasn't that American armoured units didn't know how to navigate. They knew. Every training session emphasized it. Read your map, identify terrain features, maintain orientation, track your position. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that doctrine was designed for conditions where you could see. When you couldn't see, the doctrine failed." Technical Sergeant Walter Kozlowski had been with the Third Army for 14 months. 31 years old, surveyor from Pennsylvania. He'd navigated 11 missions and had watched 6 columns fail under his navigation guidance. Not because he was a bad navigator, because he was using tools designed for different conditions. And conditions in the European theatre were almost never ideal. On his 7th mission, Kozlowski navigated a supply convoy through fog near Metz. He used standard maps, followed procedure, called out terrain features for the convoy commander. Hill to the right, road curves left ahead, village in 300 yards. Except he couldn't see any of those features. He was guessing based on the map and his estimated position. His estimates were good. The convoy reached its destination, but Kozlowski knew he'd been lucky. If his position estimate had been wrong, he'd have been calling out features that weren't there, and the convoy would have gotten lost. 8th mission was worse. Kozlowski navigated a tank platoon through a forest at night. No moon, no ambient light. Visibility essentially zero. He tried using a flashlight to check his map. The light ruined his night vision and drew attention. He tried memorizing the route. Got confused after the 4th turn. The platoon got separated. 2 tanks took a wrong turn. Ended up 3 miles off course. Took them 4 hours to relocate and rejoin. During that time, they were vulnerable, alone. If German forces had found them, they'd have been destroyed. 9th mission, Kozlowski watched an entire battalion get lost. 60 tanks, moving in fog. The lead navigator made one wrong turn. The entire formation followed. They ended up in German-held territory. Realized the mistake when they started taking fire. Had to fight their way back. Lost 11 tanks. 47 casualties. All because of one navigation error in fog. The worst part was knowing. Every time Kozlowski got assigned to navigate, he knew the maps weren't adequate. Knew that if visibility was bad, he'd be guessing. Knew that his guesses determined whether men lived or died. The responsibility crushed him. He'd lie awake before missions, rehearse routes, study maps, pray for clear weather. On the evening of December 15th, Colonel Hartwell came to the navigation tent where Kozlowski was studying maps for the Bastogne run. Hartwell asked if Kozlowski could guarantee navigation in fog, anything at all. Hartwell said the Germans had broken through. Bastogne was about to be surrounded. 400 tanks needed to move tonight, in fog, through contested territory. He needed absolute confidence in navigation. Kozlowski looked at Hartwell, saw the desperation, saw a colonel who knew standard navigation would fail and 400 tanks would be lost in the fog. Kozlowski told Hartwell to come back in 2 hours. He'd see what he could do. Kozlowski worked with his section that night. 3 other enlisted men who understood maps. They spread out route maps on the table, started converting them. Standard maps showed road network, elevation contours, forest boundaries, villages. Kozlowski's strip map showed start, main gate, travel 0.3 miles on paved road. Turn left at T-junction. Travel 1.4 miles, road surface changes to dirt. Sharp right turn. Travel 0.9 miles on dirt, cross wooden bridge. 13 hours of work. Converting 47 miles of route into sequential instructions. Each instruction based on something measurable without visibility. Distance, surface change, bridge crossings, turn angles, slope changes, things a driver could feel, hear, measure. His hands cramped from writing. His eyes burned from reading maps by lamplight. The other men in his section thought he was insane. One of them said, "Sarge, this looks like directions for a kid's treasure hunt. Command is going to laugh at us." Kozlowski said maybe, but 400 tank crews would probably die if they tried navigating with standard maps in fog, and if this system worked, nobody would be laughing. They finished at 1600 hours on December 16th, created 40 copies of the strip maps, distributed them to lead vehicles in each company, briefed the drivers. Most looked skeptical. Some asked if this was a joke. Officers called the maps kindergarten directions. Kozlowski explained, "You don't need to see terrain features. You need to follow instructions. Trust your odometer. Trust your compass. Count your turns. Feel the surface changes. The route is a sequence. Follow the sequence." At 0347, the column moved out. 400 tanks. Fog was so thick you couldn't see the tank ahead. Kozlowski was in the lead vehicle. He had his strip map. Started calling out instructions. "Maintain heading 270, travel 0.8 miles. The driver watched his odometer, called out, 0.8 miles. Surface changes from paved to dirt in 50 yards. When you feel it, turn right 90 degrees. The driver felt the surface change, turned right. Maintain new heading, travel 1.2 miles, cross small bridge, continue straight after bridge. And then all he could do was trust the system. The column moved through the fog. Kozlowski called instructions. The drivers followed them. No one could see beyond their immediate vehicle, but they could measure, could feel, could count, mile after mile, turn after turn. The strip map guided them, not by showing terrain, but by describing experience, what you would feel, what you would measure, what you would encounter. At 0612, they crossed into German-held territory. Kozlowski knew because his strip map said, "German positions begin at this point. Maintain blackout. Travel slowly. Expect contact." The column moved slow, silent, no lights, guided only by the instructions and measurements. German forces heard the tanks moving, couldn't see them in the fog, couldn't determine direction, couldn't organize effective resistance. At 0834, Kozlowski's map said, "You are now 3.2 miles from Bastogne. Terrain opens. Friendly positions ahead." They emerged from the forest at 0858, broke through the fog, saw Bastogne ahead, the entire column intact, 400 tanks. Every single vehicle had followed the strip maps through 47 miles of fog-bound terrain. Not one lost, not one separated, not one wrong turn. Kozlowski's first successful low-visibility navigation. But what he didn't know was that 17 column commanders from other units had been listening to Hartwell's radio reports. They'd heard Hartwell describe the navigation system, heard him say the column was moving confidently in zero visibility, heard him say not one vehicle was lost. Captain Frank Morrison was commanding a tank company 20 miles north. Morrison had been ordered to move his unit in fog, had refused, told his commander he couldn't navigate safely, heard Hartwell's radio traffic, heard about the strip maps. After Hartwell's column reached Bastogne, Morrison found Kozlowski, asked him directly how he'd done it. "How do you navigate 400 tanks through fog with 0 losses?" Kozlowski showed him the strip maps, explained the concept. Forget terrain features. Create sequential instructions based on measurable data, distance, surface, turns, slopes, bridges, things you can measure without seeing. Morrison asked if Kozlowski could create strip maps for other routes. Kozlowski said yes, but Morrison had to understand the risks. The maps weren't approved, weren't standard. If something went wrong, both of them would face charges. Morrison said he didn't care. He'd refused to move his unit because he knew standard navigation would fail. Men would die. If there was a system that actually worked in bad conditions, he wanted it. Regulations could wait until they won the war. That week, Kozlowski and his section created strip maps for 8 different routes. Morrison used them. Other commanders heard about them, requested them. By December 23rd, Kozlowski had created strip maps for 34 routes across the Ardennes sector. Word spread through Third Army. Commanders started requesting Kozlowski maps by name. Some staff officers resisted, said the maps weren't proper military cartography. Others pointed to the results. Hartwell's column, 400 tanks, 0 losses. Morrison's company, moved in fog, reached objective, no navigation failures. By January 1945, maybe 70 armoured units in Third Army had strip maps for their operational areas. Navigation failure rates dropped 87%, from an average of 3.2 failures per month per division to 0.4 failures per month in divisions using strip maps. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Major Robert Chen was operations officer for the 6th Armoured Division. He heard about Kozlowski's maps from a battalion commander who'd used them. Chen was skeptical. The Army Map Service knew what they were doing. Standard maps were tested, proven. But Chen tried strip maps for one-night movement. His column navigated through fog to their objective. 0 errors. Perfect execution. First time his division had successfully moved armour in low visibility without losses. Chen ordered strip maps created for his entire division's operational area. Never had another navigation failure in fog. After the war, he told anyone who'd listen that Kozlowski's system had saved his division from disaster during the Battle of the Bulge. By February 1945, the Army Map Service had noticed that navigation failures had virtually stopped in certain units. They investigated, found the strip maps, traced them back to Kozlowski. The Map Service's report was carefully worded. The maps were unauthorized, not cartographically standard, but they were effective. Navigation failure rates in units using strip maps were 87% lower than units using standard maps in low visibility conditions. The question wasn't whether the system worked. The question was whether to punish Kozlowski for creating unauthorized navigation materials or quietly adopt the technique army-wide. The Germans noticed. By January 1945, German forces were reporting that American armoured columns were moving confidently in conditions that should have stopped them. Units that should have been lost in fog were arriving at objectives. Attacks that should have been delayed by weather were happening on schedule. German intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They captured several American tanks. Found strip maps in some of them, studied them. The maps looked simplistic, childish almost, but German analysts recognized what they were. Sequential navigation instructions independent of visibility, brilliant in their simplicity. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin was one of Germany's most experienced staff officers. He'd planned defensive operations across Europe. In January 1945, he studied captured strip maps, wrote in his report, "The Americans have solved low-visibility navigation. Their armoured units can now move in conditions we relied on to slow their advances. This represents a significant tactical advantage." German forces tried to create similar systems, but they were defending. Americans were attacking. Defenders need to know terrain. Attackers need to move through it. The strip map system favoured attackers. By March 1945, American armoured units were moving in weather conditions that would have stopped them 6 months earlier. Fog, darkness, heavy rain, conditions that German forces thought would provide protection, Those conditions no longer helped, and it all came down to hand-drawn maps that nobody was supposed to create. The system never became fully official during the war. The Army Map Service reviewed Kozlowski's work in March 1945, sent cartographers to interview him. Their conclusion was that the system was unorthodox but highly effective, should be integrated into standard navigation training. The Map Service issued guidance in April 1945 on creating movement strip maps for low-visibility operations, but Kozlowski never received official credit. No commendation, no medal, no promotion. The official Map Service documentation attributed the navigation improvement to field experience and operational feedback. Kozlowski's name didn't appear. Hartwell survived the war, commanded armoured units until June 1945, returned to Virginia, stayed in the Army, retired as a brigadier general in 1959. He never forgot what Kozlowski had done, told the story to every officer he trained, made sure they understood that the best solutions often come from NCOs who see problems the staff officers miss. Morrison also survived. He commanded tanks until Germany surrendered, stayed in the Army, retired as a colonel in 1963. He wrote a letter to the Army Map Service in 1946 recommending Kozlowski for recognition. The letter was filed, no action taken. Kozlowski stayed in the Army until 1946, returned to Pennsylvania, went back to surveying, started his own survey company in Pittsburgh in 1948. He worked land surveys for 37 years, never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a navigator, moved tanks through Europe, that's all. In 1981, a military historian researching Ardennes campaign operations found references to strip maps in unit logs from Third Army. The historian tracked down Kozlowski through Army records. Kozlowski was 68 years old by then, still working part-time on surveys. The historian asked him about the map system. Kozlowski confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the system prevented between 60 and 90 column losses based on navigation failure rate changes in units that used strip maps. At an average of 35 men per lost column, that meant roughly 2,100 to 3,150 lives saved. Kozlowski said he never counted. He just remembered the columns that made it through. Hartwell's 400 tanks, Morrison's company, Chen's division, the others. That was enough. Walter Kozlowski died in 2001 at age 88. He was buried in National Cemetery of the Alleghenies in Pennsylvania. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as a navigation specialist. It did not mention the strip map system, did not mention that he'd changed how armoured units moved through low visibility conditions, did not mention that he'd broken regulations to save thousands of lives. His survey company in Pittsburgh closed in 2003. But in the old office, there's a faded photograph. A young sergeant in army uniform standing next to a map table. The date written on the back is December 1944, Belgium. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through official channels or engineering committees. Through sergeants and navigators who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.